As we head into fall, you can tell I'm feeling a bit nostalgic and looking back towards the games of my childhood. This time, we're hanging out with the Halo franchise, specifically the first two entries. While Halo is often remembered as a perfect shooter, its development cycles were anything but. To really understand the story, I think we need to revisit just how foundation-shaking the original Halo Combat Evolved was, and how big a risk Bungie made in developing it. For most of the company's early history, Bungie developed exclusively for the Macintosh system, bringing a passionate fanbase around their Marathon series. Being exclusive to Mac was obviously not going to bring Bungie to the heights they aspired to, and so they began working on porting their games to Windows systems, much to the chagrin of their die-hard fanbase who felt betrayed. Despite this, their first joint Windows-Mac release, Myth, would be a great success. Myth's success offered Bungie a bit of breathing room and allowed them to upgrade their Chicago offices while opening a second West Coast office in San Jose. The West Coast team would be assigned to work on a game called Oni, while the original Chicago office threw their all into Myth 2, which would release only a year after its predecessor due to the frantic work effort and heavy spending by Bungie. Mere days before the scheduled release of Myth 2, one of Bungie's programmers made a horrifying discovery. When you ran Myth 2's uninstaller, it didn't just uninstall the game, it wiped your entire hard drive. Even worse, Bungie had already shipped some 200,000 copies to stores around the world. This was well before a day one patch could be deployed and fixed this issue. Bungie would have to recall and remanufacture every single copy of the game. Bungie pulled it off, but at a huge cost. The recall cost around $1 million to correct, and for a young studio who just blew through their budget to finish the game, Bungie was really on the rocks financially. Following this disastrous release, Bungie hired ex-Apple employee Peter Tamte to help grow the company and begin work on their new real-time strategy game, Halo. Halo would play similar to Myth, and take heavy inspiration from StarCraft with a heavier focus on micro instead of macro. Gone was the resource gathering and management. Players would take control of Master Chief, a super soldier accompanied by his Marine squadron as they fled from the hostile aliens known as the Covenant. Bungie had barely decided on the name when Tamte told the team they would be giving a demo at Macworld 1999, presented by Tamte's old friend, Steve Jobs. Bungie's engineers frantically threw together a barely functional PC demo that showed Marines and aliens exchanging fire and showed off some of the Myth engine's physics capabilities. Jobs was really impressed and agreed to do the presentation. However, just 2 days before Jobs was set to present, Bungie realized that the Mac's fledgling OpenGL technology did not work yet, and importantly, that meant their demo would be without sound. Bungie frantically worked to burn the demo's sound effects to a CD and carefully line up the action to the sound. Despite this jury-rigged presentation, it went over well for Bungie. They promised a seamless world without levels or loading screens, open terrain, fauna, flora, weather, celestial events, and more. All this with the backing of legendary Steve Jobs meant that the expectations for this game were already through the roof. With the bar raised tremendously and Bungie still reeling from the disaster of Myth 2, they were forced to seek out acquisition to secure funding to actually finish Halo. This led them first to Take-Two Interactive, and then to meeting with Microsoft, who was actively developing their Xbox console, and looking to fill out a roster of games for its launch. Microsoft, like everyone else, was quite impressed with Halo, though they were concerned with how an RTS would fare on a console system. As Bungie and Microsoft continued to negotiate, Bungie would again put on an 11th-hour demo of Halo at E3 2000. As the game developed, it became clear that the story was shaping more and more around the iconic Master Chief, and that the story could work if it starred the man behind the gun, and thus, Bungie pivoted once more, from a third-person RTS to a first-person shooter. Gone was the promised open world without loading, and in was a tight, linear shooter. Shortly after this decision was made, Microsoft would finally fully acquire Bungie, moving them to their Redmond campus and giving Bungie access to the Xbox development kit, with one little contingency. The game had to be released to the Xbox, and solely on the Xbox. You have 9 months. At this point, the game had solely been developed on PC and Mac. Bungie had a tiny amount of console experience in developing Oni for the PlayStation, but was well out of their depth. Not only that, but Bungie hadn't even begun on the campaign of the game yet. What followed was an insane and miserable period of crunch. Crunch is typically described as being required to work 50+ hours a week or more. Bungie employees regularly worked 16+ hour days in a sterile, cubicle-filled Microsoft office that the more free-spirited Bungie employees hated. This had them clocking in at around 112 hours a week, leaving little time to even sleep. Due to the insane crunch, very little information about the game would be released following E3. The only thing reporters could get out of Microsoft was repeated promises that the game would release on PC and Mac. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't. A Mac and PC port would come years later, however. This move made Steve Jobs apoplectic. When he heard the news, he called Microsoft's Steve Ballmer directly and screamed at him for over an hour. Despite igniting an immense rage amongst Bungie's original Mac fanbase, as we all know, Halo Combat Evolved would release and sell gangbusters. Halo would become a tentpole franchise for the Xbox, and nearly half of every new Xbox sold included an additional Halo purchase alongside it. Microsoft was, of course, overjoyed, and felt assured that they had found their golden goose. Bungie, pleased that their financial troubles were over, were still recovering from 9 months of 16-hour days. Halo released in November of 2001, and by just after Christmas, Microsoft was back and wanting more, asking Bungie for a timeline on the sequel. Despite everyone at Bungie being put through the ringer, their answer was of course we're ready to start in a sequel. What would follow is one of the most hellish development cycles of all time. The months in between starting development and watching the history-making release of Halo allowed Bungie to really study what worked and of course, what didn't. Jamie Griesemer, the design lead of what would become Halo 2, immediately noticed the onslaught of hacky workarounds and practices built into Halo's engine. The team, under intense crunch, leaned heavily on the powerful Xbox hardware to do a lot of the game's heavy lifting. For Halo 2, they would toss all their old work out and properly rewrite every single procedure with the benefit of much greater funding and deeper understanding of the console itself. At least, that was the plan. Anyone who has worked in software development before knows the huge leaps your code takes as you become more familiar with the language, framework, and hardware you're operating on. Halo 2 would be no exception. One of the very first things Bungie set out to correct was the lack of online multiplayer. The LAN networking for the original Halo was hastily thrown together a mere few weeks before release, and became one of the core features for developing the game's fanbase. The lack of online multiplayer was one of the biggest flaws of the game, Griesemer says. Every previous Bungie game had been all about playing with your friends. Myth, Marathon, and Minotaur all heavily featured multiplayer functionality, so its exclusion in Halo was unacceptable. Not only did Bungie anticipate that multiplayer would add fun to the game, but it was an excellent way to test out the various features of the game on each other. On the more creative side, an epic narrative was developing with a cinematic campaign and numerous missions being written to satisfy those who cared more about the still nascent story of Halo. Bungie spent most of 2002 rewriting the Halo engine, sending out the occasional promo image or video to journalists, but it wasn't until E3 2003 that the world would be shown its first glimpse of Halo 2. The demo showed off many of the new features in the Halo engine: dual wielding, hijacking vehicles, and huge Michael Bay-esque conflicts raging in the background of New Mombasa. Expectations were already high, but this sent them into orbit. The demo appeared to the public as that of a game nearly complete, undergoing some final polishing before release. However, it was all smoke and mirrors. It took everything Bungie had just to get the demo looking presentable for just the few, narrowly selected shots. It became abundantly clear to Bungie engineers that this graphical engine was far too heady to actually work. Following the demo, they scrapped the entire thing. Not only did this essentially mean they wasted the last year, but it put the art department in a real bind. Everything they made was unable to be tested in-game, and had to be superimposed over mock-ups. Bungie engineers continued to overdevelop, creating massive sprawling levels and maps that would ground any engine at the time to a screeching halt. Halo 2's infamous flood level, to many including myself, seemed enormous. In reality, it was a hugely trimmed version, measuring only about 20% of the intended size with a fraction of the mobs present. The campaign itself had to be massively scaled back. It initially included what was essentially Halo 2 and Halo 3's story. The infamous cliffhanger wasn't intended, but was merely a product of Bungie's massively overestimating their ability to deliver. The initial development push wasn't actually all that bad, but now, Bungie had essentially wasted years of development time and had very little working product to show for it, and thus, the true crunch began. Bungie once again found themselves staring at a release date less than a year away, with no engine, environments that would melt any hardware of the time, and hundreds of partially working features that were sprinkled in over a campaign that would have taken 2 games to tell. The next 10 or so months would be some of the most brutal crunch the game industry has ever seen. One developer kept a log of when he came and went to work. He would come in at around 7 or 8 a.m. and leave the office close to midnight. He did this every single day for close to 10 months. For many of the winter months, Bungie staff never saw the sunlight. Hygiene was a fading memory, and their families felt like a dream. One dev is quoted as saying, "Oh my god, we're fucked. We're all going to die." Of course, this crunch happened with Halo 1 as well, as we previously discussed. Instead of addressing the issues that led to that crunch, Bungie management gleefully took in the now massive budget they were provided and only amplified the problems. This isn't really all that surprising given the age of everyone there. While Bungie had been around for a few years, many of their senior staff were still under the age of 30 and had little corporate or management experience outside of the projects they had previously run at Bungie. This time, with money no longer a rate-limiting factor, there was nothing keeping their ambition in check. One developer described development with a piece of art. He drew it up on a large whiteboard. He depicted Halo 2 as a burning plane, trying to land on a tiny runway while people tossed crates out the back. Each crate was labeled with the name of a various feature they would have to cut on it. Hilariously, the whiteboard ran out of space before the crates did. Somehow, despite the horrific work-life balance, Bungie pulled it off again. They managed to release Halo 2 on time and to enormous success. Halo 2 sold a record 2.4 million copies in the first 24 hours, for what would go on to become the highest-grossing opening weekend for any entertainment product ever. Of course, this huge abuse of the workforce would go on to inspire the game industry to change, and everyone went on to prioritize things outside of corporate profit at all costs, right?